She'd been standing in the freight doorway of Zora's kitchen for 11 minutes before she said it. She wore an orange delivery jacket, 3 sizes too big, worn open now because she couldn't zip it anymore. Her right sneaker split at the toe, stitched shut with dental floss in careful little crosses. 27 years old, shivering in her oversized jacket. She'd ridden 4 miles through a February freeze to hand him a bag of takeout that had gone cold an hour ago. Her name was Juniper Holloway. Rafferty Koval knew that much, and not much else, except that for 5 months he'd been setting a cup of coffee on the window ledge at 11 at night and turning his back, so she wouldn't have to thank him for it. She never once came inside, not one time. He asked her why, early on, and she said, "If I come in, then I have to leave again." That was the whole answer. Then, on a Tuesday in July, she stood in that doorway with no delivery bag at all, and she asked him, "Mr. Koval, could you be my husband? Just for one day." You should understand who she was asking. In Riverbend, on the east side of Cleveland, grown men crossed the street rather than pass Rafferty Koval on the sidewalk. Black coat, black hair, a thin scar riding the bone under his left eye that he'd never explained to anybody. Not once. Not even to the woman he married. He buried her at 30. He never took the crib out of the second bedroom, and the price tag was still hanging off the rail. And here was a bicycle courier with floss in her shoe, asking him to be her husband for a single day. He set down his coffee. He didn't say yes. He said, "Only if you tell me why." She gave him a reason that night, and it was true, and it wasn't the truth. She'd give him 3 answers over the next 5 years, each one truer than the last, and the last one wouldn't come from her at all. If this is your kind of story, hit that like button so it finds somebody else tonight. Share it with a friend who needs it, and subscribe, because there's a new one waiting every week. Now let's go back to that doorway in February, and the question nobody in Riverbend saw coming. In Riverbend, Koval wasn't a name. It was weather. People adjusted to it the way they adjusted to a storm they'd been warned was coming, putting on another coat, taking a different route, lowering their voices when they entered a room where it was sitting. Tomas Koval built Koval & Sons Transport from 2 battered box trucks and a promise. And the most important thing about that promise was that it had never been written down anywhere. No contract, no signature, nothing that could be taken into a courtroom. There was only the fact that the little grocery stores on the east side of the city, the stores owned by newcomers, the stores where it took the police 40 minutes to arrive if they came at all, were left untouched. How people paid for that depended on the family, and no one ever spoke of it afterward. Rafferty inherited all of it when he was too young to understand what he was inheriting. He thought he'd been given a network. It took him a very long time to understand that he'd been given a shadow, and that shadow fell across anyone who stood too close. He remembered exactly one evening with his father, and one evening was all he needed. He was 15 that year, sitting in the passenger seat of the truck on a Thursday night, making deliveries to stores that weren't worth the trouble, places where the entire shipment couldn't even cover the cost of the fuel. He'd asked his father why they had to go. Tomas didn't take his eyes from the wet road. He said anyone could count money. A fool with a calculator could count money. That wasn't the trade. Their trade was remembering names. Remembering people's names when they had nothing left that made them worth remembering. Everything else was only inventory. Then he pulled over, carried the boxes into a store glowing beneath yellow lights, and called the owner by name, called her husband by name, called the grandchild dozing behind the counter by name. Rafferty sat in the truck, watching through the rain-speckled glass, and thought his father was a good man. It would take him nearly 20 more years to understand that his father had just taught him a sentence that was both an oath and a knife, and which one it became depended on how it was held. As for the woman he'd married, he told that story only once in his life, and this was that once. Her name was Mirella. She loved small, sweet things. She kept music playing in the kitchen all day. She argued with him for 3 straight weeks about the color of the second bedroom walls, then finally went out and bought the color she wanted herself. She was 7 months pregnant on that November night. What happened hadn't been meant for her. And afterward, people repeated that detail to him again and again, as though it were some kind of comfort. He wouldn't tell that part. He would tell only of the kitchen afterward, when he came home and the lights were still on, and an open carton of peach yogurt sat on the table, the spoon still standing in it, the foil lid peeled back less than halfway. He stood staring at that carton longer than he'd ever stared at anything else in his life. He didn't clear it away for 3 days. People waited for him to do what a man bearing the Koval name was supposed to do. They waited for blood. He didn't give it to them. He did something colder and slower. He used exactly what his father had left him, the names and the connections. And within a year and a half, the man responsible had lost his store, his business partners, his home, his standing, and even the right to have anyone in that neighborhood speak his name with decency. He was still alive. He lived, and he watched. Rafferty had thought it would heal something. It didn't heal anything. It only turned him into a story people told one another to inspire fear, and it left the second bedroom exactly as it had been, the crib already assembled and facing the window, its cardboard price tag still dangling from the rail by a plastic tie no one had cut. 4 years. He didn't enter that room, but he didn't clear it out either. Some rooms were kept unchanged, not because of hope, but because clearing them away meant agreeing. What he took from all of it was simple enough to be cruel, and he lived by it through all the years that followed. People didn't come looking for him. They came looking for the things he loved, because that was the only soft place on his body. To stand beside Rafferty Koval was to turn yourself into an address, a line written in someone's mind, a place where people could send a message. So he stood beside no one. He opened the restaurant at 11 o'clock in the morning and closed it near dawn. He still made deliveries on Thursday nights, just as his father had. He still remembered everyone's name, and he was careful to make sure none of them had any reason to remember his with affection. That was the whole life of the man standing in the kitchen behind Zora's restaurant on that icy February night, when 3 knocks sounded against the delivery door. 3 knocks, not 2. 2 knocks came from someone in a hurry. 3 came from someone who had been standing outside for a while before deciding to knock. Rafferty wiped his hands on a towel and pulled open the delivery door, and the first thing he heard wasn't the name of the restaurant, an order number, or a greeting. He heard her say thank you twice. The words spoken before the door had fully opened, spoken into empty space, spoken to the door itself. She hadn't even seen whether anyone was standing there. The freezing rain that night didn't fall. It drove sideways, the kind Cleveland still got in February, tiny grains like glass sand striking the face and settling into a thin shell over anything that remained still for too long. She stood beneath the delivery light, one hand gripping the handlebars of a bicycle propped at an angle against the wall, the other holding out an insulated bag. Her orange coat glowed beneath the light like a warning sign. It was so comically oversized that the shoulders hung almost to her elbows, and along the inside edge of the collar was a strip of cloth bearing the hand-sewn name of some man. The letters faded, and the thread frayed. She hadn't removed it. Rafferty later learned that she'd bought the coat from a driver who'd quit, paying 1/3 of what a new coat would have cost, and she'd left the other man's name where it was because removing it wouldn't have added anything, and because there were traces left by other people that she didn't believe she had the right to erase. The food inside the bag had gone cold long ago. He knew the moment he took it. She knew too, and she spoke before he could open his mouth, saying that she was terribly sorry. Waterloo Road had frozen over, so she'd been forced to take a longer route, and if the restaurant wanted to report the problem, she understood and wouldn't dispute it. She said it in the voice of someone who'd practiced saying those words many times. Rafferty looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. The toe of her right shoe had split at the seam, and someone had stitched it closed with flat white thread, each tiny cross-stitch even and patient in a way that was almost heartbreaking. He said nothing about it. He turned back inside, poured a cup of coffee from the freshly brewed pot, and brought it out to her. She stepped back half a pace. She said she wasn't allowed to accept anything from customers. Company policy didn't permit it, and she thanked him very much. Rafferty didn't argue. He never argued with anyone about things like that, because arguing meant forcing someone either to win or to lose, and both became a debt. He set the coffee on the windowsill beside the door, a concrete ledge about the width of a hand that gathered a thin crust of ice every winter, then turned his back, went inside, and began rearranging the stainless steel trays on the metal table. He didn't look back. He heard the bicycle tires rolling away over the frozen pavement, making that unmistakable crunching sound. When he came outside again, the cup was empty, placed neatly in the center of the sill, with a coin lying beside it. The following night, he invited her inside. The kitchen had warm ovens, a chair, and a place where she could sit for 10 minutes, warm herself, and then continue on her way. She stood at the threshold, looking into that brightly lit kitchen longer than she needed to, then shook her head and said something Rafferty would think about for years afterward. She said, "If I come inside, I'll only have to go back out again." She said it without bitterness, without reproach, and without the slightest desire to be pitied. She said it the way people spoke about the weather. Then she said goodbye and rode away into the freezing rain. The next morning, before 7 o'clock, the telephone in the warehouse rang. It was Wilhelmina Drago, the owner of the grocery store across the street, the woman his father had been delivering to since before Rafferty could walk, the woman who still called him Tomas's boy, even though he was 34 years old and grown men crossed the street when they saw him coming. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how he was. In the hoarse voice of someone who'd smoked for 30 years before quitting, she said only one thing: "That delivery girl from last night needs to eat." Then she hung up. Rafferty stood there, holding the receiver for a while longer, looking through the fogged window toward the other side of the street, where the lights inside Drago's had just come on. That night, he placed a cup of coffee on the windowsill before the woman arrived, and he turned his back before she had the chance to refuse it. He did the same thing the next night, and the night after that, through all of March, April, and May, until it became as much a part of the restaurant as the hum of the exhaust fan and the smell of frying onions, and until he forgot that it had never been his idea at all. In the middle of April, Drago's lost power 3 nights in a row, and all 3 were Friday nights, the busiest nights of the week. Then someone forced the lock on the back door, but nothing was taken. Not a single carton of cigarettes, not $1 from the register. Then the insurance company sent a letter announcing a premium increase, for a reason no one could understand. Wilhelmina Drago didn't call Rafferty. She wasn't the kind of woman who called. She simply opened her doors at 6 o'clock in the morning as she had for 40 years. And she began to lose weight. He heard about it from a milkman, who'd heard it from someone else, and the name that appeared at the end of that chain was Deschler, a contractor from across the river, who was buying up frontage property along that road while waiting for the city to approve new zoning plans. The following Tuesday morning, Rafferty went to his office. He didn't have an appointment. He wore a black coat, didn't take it off, and sat in the chair facing the desk like a man who'd come to submit paperwork. Deschler smiled, asked what he wanted to drink, and called him friend. Rafferty said he didn't want anything. Then he began to speak, his voice steady and no louder than the hum of the air conditioner in the room. He said Deschler's daughter attended St. Brigid, that she was in the afternoon class, and that she usually waited at the Clifton Road gate instead of the main entrance. He said Deschler's wife took Clifton Road to work, turned left at the second light, and stopped every morning at the coffee shop with the blue awning. He said Deschler ate at Petey's every Saturday morning, at the corner table, with his back to the door. Deschler stopped smiling after the second sentence. By the third, his face had gone pale, and the hand resting on the desk no longer seemed to know where it belonged. He managed to say one thing: "You're threatening me." Rafferty shook his head almost imperceptibly. He said, "I'm not threatening you, Mr. Deschler. If I were threatening you, you'd know immediately, and we wouldn't be sitting here like this. I'm showing you that I remember. That's my entire trade. What I do with the things I remember is something you choose, not me." In the doorway behind him, an older man stood with one shoulder against the frame, wearing a canvas coat, his silver hair cut close, both hands tucked into his pockets, and he didn't say a single word throughout the meeting. He simply stood there. People called him Augie Pell, and he'd been standing in doorways like that since the days when he worked for Tomas Koval. Rafferty rose and fastened the button of his coat again. He said, "Drago's opens at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. If it can open, you and I will never have to speak again, and I'll forget everything I've just told you in this room." Then he walked out. The next morning, the lights at Drago's came on at 6 o'clock, and they continued coming on at that exact hour for all the years that followed. No one forced the lock again. The insurance company's letter never came a second time. And when Rafferty stepped out of the office building that morning, an unmarked gray car was parked at an angle across the street, and the person behind the wheel didn't look away when Rafferty stared directly at him. Spring came slowly to Cleveland, arriving a little at a time, and Rafferty measured it by the bicycle outside the delivery door. All winter, she jumped off while the bicycle was still moving, one foot touching the ground first, the motion of someone who'd done it thousands of times and no longer had to think about it. Then, one evening near the end of April, he heard the wheels stop sooner than usual. And when he looked outside, she was walking the bicycle up onto the sidewalk, both hands gripping the handlebars, moving slowly, placing each foot with the care of someone crossing ice even though the pavement had been dry for a long time. She didn't jump off anymore. He didn't ask. He didn't look down at her stomach, didn't study her face any longer than usual, and didn't change a single word in the brief exchanges they shared in that doorway. He simply knew, and once something like that was known, it couldn't be made unknown. There were things no one needed to say aloud. From that night on, he began leaving her real food, not bread, but something with meat, something hot and full of broth, something he told the cook to make one extra serving of every night without asking why. He put it in a cardboard container, closed the lid, and placed a white porcelain bowl upside down on top to keep the lid from blowing away when the wind swept through the delivery passage. She never took the bowl, whether she ate or didn't eat, whether she left the container behind or carried it away. The bowl always returned to the same place, turned upside down and set neatly in position, and beneath it, every night, there was money. It wasn't enough for the entire meal because she couldn't afford that, but there was always something, carefully calculated, sometimes a few crumpled bills, sometimes only a handful of coins counted out to the exact amount. The next morning, Rafferty would come outside, lift the bowl, and leave the money untouched. He wouldn't take it. He would turn the bowl upside down again. The following night, she would add more. The next morning, he would leave it untouched again. It continued that way until a small collection of loose change had accumulated beneath that white porcelain bowl. Money they both knew was there. Money each knew the other knew about, yet neither of them said a single word about it for months. It was the longest silent battle Rafferty had ever fought, and he'd fought more than a few, but it was the only one he knew he wouldn't win. He didn't take the money because taking it would turn the food into merchandise and turn her into someone buying on credit. She didn't stop leaving money because to stop would mean admitting that she was accepting something, and accepting meant the beginning of a debt, and she'd learned long ago that a debt was something people would demand repayment for at the precise moment when she had nothing left to give. Neither of them yielded. The money beneath the bowl continued to grow thicker. The bowl remained where it was, and they both pretended nothing was happening. One evening in May, when daylight still lingered late, Rafferty stood in the delivery passage and looked down at her shoes once more. He'd seen them since February, but now, 3 months later, the wear was showing even worse. The original white thread along the split toe had yellowed. Several of the careful little crosses had broken under the daily strain, and fresh stitches had been painstakingly worked over the old ones. It was the work of someone who had time but no money, done during some quiet evening in a room he'd never seen. He looked at it for about 3 seconds, then turned away, and that night he couldn't find a decent word for anyone in the kitchen. Augipel grumbled. He'd been grumbling since March, and he grumbled all through the spring, saying that the restaurant wasn't a church, that he'd worked for the Koval family since Rafferty was crawling beneath tables, and had never once seen his father give away food to a hired delivery girl from another company, that the staff was beginning to notice, that people would talk. Rafferty listened to all of it without interrupting or arguing. Then he went into the kitchen, closed the lid of the cardboard container, and placed the white porcelain bowl upside down on top. July in Riverbend was hot, humid, and still, the heat of a city beside a lake, the kind that clung to the skin and went nowhere even after the sun had set. On that Tuesday night, Rafferty heard the usual 3 knocks, and he opened the door with a closed cardboard container already in his hand, then stopped. She had no insulated bag. There was no bicycle propped against the wall. She'd come on foot, and she'd been standing there for a while before knocking because her hair had dried again after the long walk, and the orange coat was folded over her arm instead of covering her body. It was the first time he'd seen her without that layer of orange fabric concealing her, and he didn't look down, but he didn't need to. She said she was sorry for coming at that hour without an order. She said she would only take a few minutes of his time. Then she fell silent, and he realized she was waiting for him to say something she could hold on to so she could continue. He said nothing. He simply stood there and allowed the silence to do its work. At last, she said it. The company had found out. Someone had reported her, or someone had seen her, or perhaps they'd simply reached the point when the coat could no longer hide it. The dispatcher had called her in and spoken in the voice of someone reading from a sheet of paper, instead of talking to a human being, telling her that in her current condition, she wasn't permitted to work outdoor routes anymore. It was an insurance regulation. No one was trying to make things difficult for her. She had 2 choices. The first was to take unpaid leave until after the baby was born, and she knew what unpaid leave meant. It meant losing her rented room within 3 weeks. The second was to transfer to conditional part-time employee status, which meant she could keep her shifts and qualify for the group insurance plan. But to complete that paperwork, she had to prove that someone lived with her, that there was an address bearing both their names, and that another adult would sign the declaration and sit beside her while they asked their questions. She had 2 days. She stated the number calmly, as though she were talking about a bus ride. Then she asked, "Mr. Koval, could you be my husband, just for 1 day?" Rafferty set the cardboard container on the windowsill. He didn't answer immediately. She misunderstood his silence and began speaking faster, reciting the part she'd clearly rehearsed somewhere, perhaps during the entire walk there. She said she didn't need him to love her. She said she didn't need him to touch her, didn't need him to give her a single dollar, and didn't need him to tell anyone about it. She said she needed only 1 hour in an office, needed him to sit beside her and sign wherever they told him to, and afterward she would sign papers to end it whenever he wanted. Then she would disappear from his life. She would request another route, and would never ride her bicycle along that road again. She said the last part as though she were offering him a condition that worked in his favor. And as she spoke, Rafferty understood something that sent a chill down his spine in the middle of that hot July night. She hadn't chosen him because he was wealthy. She hadn't chosen him because he had power. She'd chosen him because she believed he was the kind of man who wouldn't ask another question. She'd watched him from that doorway for 5 months, and concluded that he was a man who would sign his name, say nothing, and never mention it again. It was the kindest thing anyone could have believed about him, and it was also the saddest, and she was offering it to him as a compliment. He asked one more question. He said, "Only if you tell me why." She blinked. She said, "I just told you." He said, "You told me the regulation. You haven't told me why." She stood beneath the delivery light, still clutching the orange coat against her body, and for one brief moment Rafferty saw what she'd been hiding for 5 months. The real exhaustion, the real fear. It passed across her face like the shadow of a cloud moving over a road, then vanished at once. Then she said, "Because I don't have anyone else left to ask." That was the first answer. It was true. It wasn't the whole truth. And later he would understand that it wasn't even close to the truth. But he didn't know that on this night, and on this night, it was enough. He said yes. He asked what time, where they needed to go, and which documents he needed to bring. And she recited each item to him from memory. She thanked him 3 times. He told her to stop. Then she walked away toward Waterloo Road, and Rafferty remained in that doorway for a long time, his hands in his pockets, watching her go. He didn't tell her that it had been a very long time since anyone had asked him for a favor. People made demands of him, hired him, begged him, and feared him. But they didn't ask. He went into the kitchen, turned off some of the lights, and didn't see it until he came back to lock the delivery door. The orange insulated bag was sitting on the windowsill beside the cardboard container whose lid remained unopened, the one she'd forgotten to take with her, or hadn't intended to take, or simply hadn't been able to think about. She'd arrived on foot with her coat in her arms, and the bag must have hung from her shoulder throughout the entire walk without her even noticing it. Rafferty picked it up. It was light. There were no food containers inside, no orders, only the smell of warm plastic and old canvas, a scent he'd known for 5 months without ever thinking about it. He intended to leave it where it was so she could return for it. Then he opened the zipper, because if there was anything perishable inside, it would spoil overnight in the July heat. There was nothing perishable inside. There was a thin cloth wallet with worn corners, an empty water bottle, a key tied to a shoelace, and a sheet of paper folded into quarters, folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had turned white, and one corner was nearly torn. He didn't intend to open it. He held it in his hand and was about to fold it again and put it back, but the paper opened halfway on its own along the old creases, and the hospital's name printed at the top of the page was large enough to read without trying. He read the rest. The appointment form bore the name Juniper Rose Halloway. It listed a time, early the next morning. It named the department. It named a procedure he didn't recognize, but he understood enough to know that no one underwent something like that for pleasure. At the bottom of the page, inside a box outlined in heavy ink that the hospital probably used for every appointment form of that kind, one sentence appeared in bold capital letters. The patient wasn't permitted to leave alone after the procedure. The patient had to be accompanied by an adult. He read the sentence, then read it a second time. He stood in the delivery passage with the paper in his hand, the light burning overhead and cicadas calling beyond the parking lot, and everything in his mind rearranged itself into a different order. The appointment at the personnel office was real. The 2-day deadline was real. The declaration of shared residence, the signature line, the insurance regulation, all of it was real. And she'd told him every detail without leaving anything out. She simply hadn't told him the other half. She hadn't told him that the next morning, before any office opened its doors, she would have to lie down on a table in a place she'd gone to alone, and afterward they wouldn't allow her to walk out the door by herself. She'd walked there through the July heat to ask him for 1 hour, and she'd calculated every word, and she'd omitted the one part that would have made it impossible for him to refuse. He stood there and understood why. Because that part wasn't a regulation. That part was about her being afraid, and fear was something she didn't tell anyone about. Not a man standing in a doorway. Not a man she'd spent 5 months taking such care not to owe. Asking for a signature was still a matter of paperwork. Asking someone to sit in a hallway and wait for her was something else entirely. Rafferty folded the paper along its original creases, returned it to where it had been, closed the zipper, and carried the orange bag into the kitchen. He placed it on the steel table, directly beneath the brightest light. Then he took out his telephone and canceled everything on his schedule for the following morning. The next morning, he parked some distance from the entrance to the Fleet Line Logistics Depot and waited there. When she arrived, she saw the black car before she saw him, and she stopped for a moment on the sidewalk. She didn't ask why he'd come so early. She only thanked him. And he handed her the orange insulated bag that she thought he'd brought back. And she took it, then fumbled with it, uncertain whether to sling it over her shoulder or carry it in her hand. The personnel office was on the ground floor of a row of corrugated metal buildings in the industrial district, with a low ceiling and fluorescent lights, one of which flickered for the entire hour without anyone bothering to replace it. Rafferty Koval, a man with 3 attorneys on his payroll, one of whom had never done anything except wait for his telephone calls, sat in a blue plastic chair with his knees touching the edge of the desk, and filled out a declaration using a pen that was nearly out of ink. His pen died on the second line. He asked to borrow one, and she handed him hers, a plastic ballpoint pen with the name of a pharmacy printed along the barrel, the kind left in a box at the counter for anyone who needed one. He signed with that pen. He wrote his address in the address box, wrote his name beside hers, and didn't look at her while he did it. The personnel manager was a man about his age, wearing a short-sleeved shirt and a plastic identification badge, and he spoke with the rehearsed politeness of someone who'd memorized the procedure. When everything had been signed, Rafferty folded the paper and asked 3 questions. He spoke very softly, his voice steady, using the same tone he always used when he had no need to speak loudly. He asked where in the employee handbook the company's maternity leave policy was written. He asked how long the waiting period was before a conditional part-time employee qualified for the group insurance plan, and who was responsible for approving it. Then he asked for the manager's full name, and repeated it once to make certain he had it right. The man sat up straighter. No one threatened anyone. No one raised his voice. But the man sat up straight and answered all 3 questions, then added that he would personally forward the application instead of placing it in the waiting tray. When they reached the car, Juniper fastened her seatbelt and sat in silence for a while. She asked what he'd just done. He said he'd only asked a few questions. She looked at him and seemed about to say something, then decided against it. He didn't turn left onto the main road toward Riverbend. He turned right. She sat up straighter. She said, "Mr. Koval, this isn't the way back to the restaurant." He said he knew. She said, "I still have somewhere else to go. You can let me out at the next corner. I can take the bus." He kept his eyes on the road. He said, "Your appointment form says 8 o'clock, and if we go around by the bridge at this hour, we'll be 15 minutes late." She fell silent. He heard her breathe out, one long breath. The kind a person released when something they'd been straining to hold for days suddenly slipped from their grasp through no fault of their own. She turned toward the window and didn't speak again until the car entered the parking lot. Only when she opened the door to get out did she say, without turning back, that she truly had forgotten the bag and hadn't left it behind on purpose. He said he knew. The waiting room was on the 3rd floor, with plastic chairs arranged in 2 rows facing each other, a television mounted on the wall showing a cooking program without sound, and the smell of hand sanitizer everywhere. There were 7 or 8 couples in the room. Every man was holding someone's hand, resting his hand on the back of the chair behind his wife's shoulder, carrying a handbag for someone, or leaning down to whisper into the ear of the person beside him. Rafferty sat at the end of the row, both hands resting on his knees, leaving just enough space between himself and Juniper that no one would think they were strangers, but no one would imagine they were anything more. When her name was called and she stood, he didn't wish her good luck, because he didn't know how to say it in a way that sounded right. He only nodded once. Then she disappeared behind the door, and he remained alone in that waiting room filled with men holding someone's hand, his right hand gripping the edge of the plastic chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He held it that way for a very long time, and no one in the room knew why. When everything was over, a doctor came out to find him, a tall woman wearing thin framed glasses, with the name Adeyemi printed on her badge. She spoke to him in the calm voice of someone who'd been doing this work for many years. She said everything had gone as expected. She said Juniper needed rest, and she told him to take his wife home and make sure she remained in bed for the rest of the day. Rafferty stood there and didn't correct her. Behind them, sitting on a wheeled bed with a thin blanket pulled up to her stomach, Juniper had heard it too, and she didn't correct her either. The 3-week wait for the results was the longest stretch of time Rafferty had lived through since that November. And the strange thing was that he had no right to be anxious. He wasn't the baby's father. He wasn't family. He was a name on a declaration of shared residence, tucked inside a file folder in an industrial district across the city. But he counted every day, and he knew he was counting, and he told no one. Juniper returned to her route after taking 3 days off. She still walked her bicycle onto the sidewalk. She still left money beneath the bowl. Neither of them mentioned that morning again, not even once, and they held the memory between them as though each were carrying a glass filled to the brim with water, afraid to tilt it. Then the hospital called. She sent him a brief message containing only the date, the time, and the name of the department. There was nothing else, and that said more than any sentence could have. He went to pick her up. Dr. Adeyemi began with the good news, and she gave it first because she knew the people sitting across from her hadn't slept properly in 3 weeks. She said there were no abnormalities with the baby. Every measurement was within the normal range. She said the baby was a girl. Juniper nodded once, barely moving, and the hands resting in her lap closed into fists, then opened again. Then Dr. Adeyemi turned to the second page, and her voice changed. She said the problem wasn't with the baby. She said Juniper's blood work showed anemia severe enough to require treatment. Her blood pressure was higher than the doctor wanted to see at this stage. She hadn't gained even half the recommended amount of weight, and there were early signs of a condition whose full medical name she gave before repeating it in language an ordinary person could understand. It was a condition affecting the mother's body, not the baby. It could be managed with monitoring and rest, and it could become very serious without them. She put down her pen. She asked how many hours Juniper worked each day. Juniper answered. The doctor asked again, more slowly, as though giving her an opportunity to change the number. Juniper repeated the same number. Dr. Adeyemi removed her glasses. She said, "Miss Holloway, I'm going to be direct, because I believe you're someone who can bear hearing the truth directly. Riding a bicycle outdoors for 10 hours a day at this stage of pregnancy, with blood pressure like this, isn't merely strenuous. It's dangerous. I'm not trying to frighten you. I'm telling you what I see on this page. If you continue, there is a possibility that we'll have to deliver the baby far too early. And when a baby comes that early, everything becomes more difficult for both of you." The room was silent for a while. The ceiling fan turned slowly. Rafferty sat motionless. Then Juniper asked, in the same calm voice she used when asking the time or requesting directions, "Doctor, if there ever comes a point when you can save only one of us, please save my daughter." Dr. Adeyemi raised her eyes and looked at her for a long time. She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "Miss Holloway, I don't like the way you asked that question." She said medicine didn't work that way, and no one in that room was permitted to speak that way. Then she added that the baby needed a mother who was here, not a mother who had already prepared herself to lose. Juniper nodded and said, "Yes, I understand." And she said it the way people said yes simply to bring something to an end. When they reached the car, she fastened her seatbelt, and she didn't cry. Rafferty had prepared himself for her to cry. He'd already decided that he wouldn't say anything, and would simply let her cry until she had nothing left. She didn't cry. She bent down, searched through the orange bag, and took out an old notebook with a blue cover. Its cover was soft, all 4 corners had curled, and the spine had been repaired with clear tape in 2 places. She opened it in her lap, turned to a page near the back, picked up the ballpoint pen bearing the pharmacy's name, and began to calculate. He didn't look at the page. He had no right. He saw only her hand, watched the tip of the pen touch the paper and pause, run through a line of numbers, stop again, cross something out, and write it over. She did it quickly and expertly, without having to think about the method, thinking only about the result, with the practiced skill of someone who'd done the same thing thousands of times on thousands of evenings. She was rearranging her entire life after being told that she might not survive the winter. And she was doing it in her lap, inside someone else's car, in the middle of a hospital parking lot, with a pen she'd borrowed from a pharmacy counter. Rafferty sat behind the wheel and watched her do it, and something inside him, something that had frozen solid on that November night many years before, something he'd believed had died completely, broke open. Rafferty Covell had spent his entire life in a world where every problem was a door. Every door had a key, and his job was to discover who was holding it, so he did the thing he knew how to do. On Monday morning, he called Fleetline Express and spoke with the person in charge of corporate accounts. He said his 3 restaurants would transfer all their delivery business to Fleetline, every route, under a 1-year contract paid quarterly in advance. It was a large enough contract to change the other person's tone halfway through a sentence. Then Rafferty added one small condition, almost as an afterthought. There was an employee named Juniper Holloway working outdoor routes, and he wanted her transferred to the indoor dispatch department, with a permanent shift, a desk, a chair, insurance, and pay no lower than what she currently earned. The person on the other end said that was within their power. Rafferty ended the call, and for approximately 3 days, he felt more relieved than he had at any moment since that morning in the hospital parking lot. 3 days. On the 4th night, she came to the restaurant, and she didn't knock 3 times. She pounded on the door. He opened it and found her standing there with her orange coat hanging open, her hair clinging to her temples, and a sheet of paper in her hand that had been crumpled and then smoothed flat again. She didn't greet him. She asked whether he knew how long it had taken her to get that job. Rafferty said he didn't. She said 4 months. She said she'd applied at 31 places, and she remembered the number because she'd written down every one of them. The date she applied, the name of the person who interviewed her, and even the words they used to reject her, so she would know what to avoid the next time. She said she'd walked to 23 of those 31 places because she didn't have a bicycle yet. She said that job was the only thing in her life she'd ever earned entirely on her own. No one had given it to her, no one had pitied her, and no one had signed anything for her. She'd walked through the front door, sat down, and they'd hired her. Then she said, her voice breaking for the first time, that now it belonged to him. She said the dispatcher had called her into the office and congratulated her, and everyone in the room had stared at her, and she'd stood there without understanding what was happening until someone mentioned the new contract involving 3 restaurants in Riverbend. She said that now, every time she sat at that desk, and every time she received her paycheck, she would know it wasn't hers. He said, "I was only trying to help you." She stood still for a moment. Then she said the words he would carry with him for a very long time. She said, "You didn't help me. You handled me. Those are 2 different things." She said every man who'd ever entered her life had believed he was helping her. They always believed that. They made decisions for her, signed things for her, chose what was best for her, and not one of them had ever asked her a single question first. She said the man who'd taken all her savings had also believed he was helping her. He'd used that exact word. He'd told her, "Let me take care of it." By the time she finished speaking, she was breathing hard, and she lifted a hand to her stomach in the reflexive gesture she'd developed over the past several months. Rafferty stepped toward her, then stopped, because he didn't know what he was permitted to do. He didn't argue. He didn't explain that he'd been afraid, that he'd sat in the hospital parking lot and watched her recalculate her life in a blue-covered notebook, or that he'd gone home that night and hadn't slept. He said nothing in his own defense because all of those things were true, and none of them was a reason. He took out his telephone in front of her, called the person in charge at Fleetline, and told him to cancel everything. Cancel the employment condition. Cancel the delivery contract too, if necessary. Restore everything to the way it had been. Then he added that if Miss Holloway suffered any consequences because of this, the man would have to speak with him again. Rafferty ended the call and slipped the telephone back into his pocket. Juniper stood there with the crumpled paper in her hand, no longer knowing what to do with anger that had suddenly lost the place where it had been anchored. He said, "I'm sorry." Then, he did something he'd never done with anyone in his life, something his father had never taught him, because his father had never done it either. He asked her what she wanted. She looked at him as though he'd spoken in another language. He repeated the question more slowly. He said, "Not what I think you need. Not what makes the most sense. What do you want?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. She stood in the delivery passage beneath that light for a very long time, so long that Rafferty thought she wouldn't answer. Then he realized something that sent a sharp ache through his chest. She wasn't silent because she was choosing among many possibilities. She was silent because no one had ever asked her that question before, and she didn't know where to begin. Near the end of August, a thick envelope from a law firm in Columbus arrived at the address of the rented room above the laundromat, and Juniper brought it to the restaurant because she didn't know where else to open it. She handed it to him and said she'd read it 3 times and still wasn't certain she understood it correctly. He read it. It concerned a fire that had happened many years earlier in an apartment complex on the west side. A fire caused by an electrical system the landlord had twice been ordered in writing to repair and hadn't repaired at all. She was 17 then, and she survived because she'd slept at a friend's house that night. She'd filed a lawsuit, and the case had dragged on for 4 years before quietly dying because she didn't have the money to hire an attorney who knew what he was doing. They'd paid her something they called assistance, an amount that wasn't enough to buy an old car, and she'd signed because she was 19 and had nothing left to eat. Now that landlord's name had surfaced again. There had been a second fire in another building he owned, and this time 14 families had joined together in one case, with real attorneys and enough money to pursue it. While reviewing the old records, someone had found her name. The letter said that because she was the only recorded survivor of the first fire, her testimony could prove that the landlord had known about the condition of the electrical system for years. On the final page, there was an offer. The defendant wanted to settle with her privately, outside court, before the class action went to trial. A sum of money. Rafferty read the number, and he knew enough about her life to understand what it meant. It meant tuition for her final semester. It meant an apartment with a window. It meant she would never have to climb onto that bicycle again, not for one more day, not through one more February. The condition appeared across the lower half of the page, written in the kind of language law firms use to make a pair of handcuffs sound like an administrative procedure. She agreed not to speak publicly. She agreed not to provide testimony. She agreed to behave as though it had never happened, forever. He handed the papers back to her and said nothing. He waited. He thought he already knew her answer, and he felt relieved, and then he felt ashamed of that relief. She read the final page once more, slowly, tracing each line with her finger. Then she folded it and said she wouldn't sign. Rafferty asked why. Not because he wanted to persuade her, but because he needed to hear her say it. She said, "If I sign, those 14 families lose a witness." She said, "I'm the only survivor from the first fire, which means I'm the proof that he knew about the problem years ago and did nothing. If I remain silent, their case becomes weaker, and they'll lose the way I lost. And then there will be a third building." He told her that she didn't owe those 14 strangers anything. She said, "I know." Then she looked up at him and said something he would later remember even longer than the question she'd asked in the doorway that July night. She said, "Mr. Koval, I've been poor for 10 years. I've eaten expired food. I've slept in places where no one should sleep. I've walked through winter because I couldn't afford the fare. But I've never sold anyone." She said, "If I accept this, my parents become an expense in his ledger. One line of expenditure, paid and filed away. I won't give him that." Then she added more softly, "I'm not rich, and I'm not noble either. This is the only thing I have." Rafferty remained silent for a long time after she finished. He'd spent his life believing that everything in the world had a price, that the duty of a man bearing the Koval name was to discover that price and pay it, and he'd believed it so completely that it had become the way he saw every person he met. Yet he was sitting across from a pregnant young woman with no insurance and no family, wearing shoes stitched together with dental floss, who'd just been offered the one thing she needed more than anyone he'd ever known, and she'd pushed it back across the table. He asked whether she wanted him to introduce her to an attorney who could stand on the same side as those 14 families. She said yes. Then she added, and this time she smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen on her face all summer. "But this time, you have to ask me first." Wilhelmina Drago called him on a Sunday morning in early September, and this time she spoke 2 sentences instead of 1. She said, "Come over here, and bring a clear head with you. The store wasn't open yet. The rolling door had been raised only halfway, and she sat on the stool behind the register with an unopened newspaper and a cup of tea that had gone cold. She told him to sit on the plastic milk crate beside her, the way he had when he was a boy, and he sat down. She asked whether he knew why the girl had knocked on his door that July night. Rafferty said she needed a signature. Willa said, wrong. She said the girl had needed a signature since June. 3 weeks before that night, she'd stood exactly where he was sitting, right there, and asked whether I knew any man in this neighborhood who would put his name beside hers for 1 hour. She said she would pay him, make payments over time, even write a promissory note. I asked who she intended to approach. She said, I don't know. I only know it can't be Mr. Koval. Rafferty sat in silence. Willa said, I asked her why not, because I knew you were the man she saw every night, and I knew you would sign without asking even half a question. She paused and turned the cup in her hands. She said, the girl answered me this way, and I remember every word because I've thought about it all summer. She said, because he's the only person I don't want to lie to. She said, if I ask him, I'll have to tell him the truth, and if I tell him the truth, I'll have to admit that I can't take care of myself. I'd rather ask a stranger because, with a stranger, I'll lose only a signature. With him, I'll lose the last part of myself I've managed to hold on to, Willa said. 3 weeks. For 3 weeks, she asked all over this neighborhood. She asked the mechanic. She asked 2 people at the church. She even asked the insurance agent at the end of the street, and none of them agreed, and one of them asked what he would get in return. Only at the very end did she come to you. Rafferty asked why she'd finally come anyway. The old woman set down her cup. She said, because of the coffee, she said. You think it was a small thing, but think carefully, Rafferty. For 5 months, every night, you placed that cup on the windowsill and turned your back to go inside. You turned away. You didn't stand there and watch her drink it. You didn't wait for her to thank you. You didn't look at her face while she accepted it. She said, do you understand what that means to a girl like her? All her life, everything she was ever given came with a look, and that look was the bill. People gave her something, then stood there waiting to collect their payment in gratitude. She said that was the first time in the girl's life that she'd been given something without having to pay anything at all. Not because you were generous, because you turned away. Rafferty sat on the plastic milk crate and couldn't speak. Willa left him alone for a while. Then she said there was something else, and she said it in an entirely different voice. The voice of someone who'd carried something too heavy for too long. She asked whether he knew anyone in Juniper's family before he knew her. She said, her younger brother. Ash. He worked here, stocked the shelves, carried boxes, swept the yard. He was 17 then, skinny as a rail, always forgetting to lock the back door. He loved fish and talked endlessly about the aquarium in his room. He named every fish until I knew all their names too, she said. Then he quit and took a construction job because they paid more. He had an accident there and broke some bone, though I never knew which one. They prescribed painkillers. He didn't survive that winter. Rafferty asked whether Juniper knew that Willa had known her brother. Willa shook her head very slowly. She said, that night, I was the one who called the ambulance. I was closer. I arrived before the girl did, and when she got there, I was already standing in the hallway. She didn't see me. She didn't see anything at all that night. She said, I've never told her, and I don't know what purpose it would serve if I did. She said, I'm telling only you, because you're the one who will stay. He walked out to his car a little after 7 o'clock in the morning. The parking lot in front of the store was still wet with dew, and only his car and a newspaper delivery truck backing out were there. Rafferty sat behind the wheel, closed the door, and didn't start the engine. The man who hadn't shed a single tear at his wife's funeral, the man whose name made everyone on the east side of the city lower their voices, sat in his car outside a grocery store on a Sunday morning and wept, both hands still resting on the steering wheel. He didn't wipe the tears away, didn't cover his face, and didn't make a sound. The ice storm descended on Cleveland on the final night of November. The kind of weather people there had a separate name for, because it wasn't snow and it wasn't rain. It simply covered the entire city in glass within 3 hours. Rafferty's telephone vibrated near 1 o'clock in the morning. Her voice was soft and unnaturally calm, the calmness of someone trying not to inconvenience anyone. She said, I think it's too early. There are still several weeks before the due date, and I've already called. They said there's a wait for an ambulance because the entire city is calling. He asked how long the wait was. She said nearly an hour. He was out the door before she finished the sentence. Waterloo Road was as slick as glass. He picked her up at the bottom of the side stairway beside the laundromat. She was already wearing the orange coat and clutching a small cloth bag that she must have packed weeks earlier. The hospital was less than 4 miles away. Those 4 miles took 40 minutes. At the curve on Fulton Road, where the pavement sloped downward and a drainage channel crossed the street, the rear tires lost their grip, and the car slid slowly sideways, almost gently, before striking the steel guardrail broadside and coming to a stop. Neither of them was hurt, but the wheels spun helplessly against the ice without moving the car an inch. Juniper began breathing rapidly. Rafferty didn't panic. She would later say that the most frightening thing about that night was that he didn't panic. He opened the door, stepped into the freezing rain driving sideways across the road, stood beside the car with the telephone pressed to his ear, and made 3 calls. The first was to Augie Pell. The second was to the night supervisor at the depot. The third was to himself, to the list he carried inside his head. The list his father had taught him to keep. Then he climbed back into the car, turned the heater as high as it would go, took off his coat and laid it across her legs, and told her it would be only 15 more minutes. 11 minutes later, the first pair of yellow lights appeared at the top of Fulton Road. Then came a second pair. Then an entire line. They were delivery trucks belonging to Koval and Sons. The old box trucks everyone in the neighborhood saw every day without noticing, each fitted with a plow every winter, so the drivers could clear the entrances to the depot. 2 trucks blocked the road at either end. The others began to plow. They cleared 1 lane from that curve, all the way to the emergency department entrance, spreading salt behind them. And when the route was open, 2 drivers climbed down, pressed their shoulders against Rafferty's car, pushed it away from the guardrail, then stepped back and waved him through. Not one of them was paid an extra $1 for that night. Months later, after everything had settled, Augie Pell told Juniper the part she hadn't been there to hear. He said, "The boy didn't give an order. I've worked for the Koval family for nearly my entire life, and I've heard him give orders many times. I know that voice." He didn't use that voice that night. He pressed the radio button and said only one thing. He said, "It's June. She remembers every one of your names." Augie fell silent for a while after saying it, then continued. "Do you understand? You'd been at that depot only a few months. You asked Petrov his wife's name. You remembered that Bang's daughter was having dental work done. You asked about old Semenko's leg. No one told you to do any of that. You simply did it. Then, at 1 o'clock in the morning, in the middle of an ice storm, 40 men got out of bed without asking a single question. That was the night the entire east side of the city found out. No one could hide 40 trucks plowing a road through the middle of the night. The next morning, people told the story at Drago's, at the coffee shop on the corner, and in the church parking lot. And each time it was told, another detail was added. By the end of the week, the news had crossed the river and reached Lakewood, and all that remained of it was one short sentence. The one people liked best because it was easy to remember and sounded important. They told one another that Koval was having a baby. The baby was healthy. The doctor said it at once, then repeated it to make certain they understood, explaining that the little girl needed only time and wait, that arriving a little early meant she would have to stay a little longer, and that was all. Juniper named her Maeve, with Ash as her middle name. She said the name once to the nurse completing the paperwork, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world, offering no explanation. And Rafferty, standing in the hallway, heard it and had to turn his face away. The days that followed were long and nearly identical. The postpartum ward held 6 beds separated by fabric curtains, and Rafferty, who wasn't family and was therefore allowed inside only during visiting hours, saw the room often enough to memorize it. In the first bed on the left, a husband slept slumped in a chair with his neck bent to one side, waking every morning with a bewildered expression. In the bed opposite him, there was a mother, a grandmother, and 2 older children who kept running in and out and were constantly being told to stop. The bed at the far end of the room was surrounded by an entire family who had brought a basket filled with pastries and a silver balloon tied to the bed rail, and every afternoon, more people arrived. Beside Juniper Holloway's bed stood a gray plastic chair. It was empty. It was empty in the morning when the doctors made their rounds. It was empty at midday when the room filled with the noise of families bringing meals. It was empty in the evening when the hallway lights dimmed, and people began pulling their chairs closer to their wives' beds. She never looked toward that chair. She lay on her side facing the window, and whenever anyone asked how she was feeling, she sat up, smiled, answered politely, then lay down again. On the afternoon of the fourth day, a young nurse went around distributing paperwork, the kind every hospital had and no one read carefully. Discharge forms, vaccination forms, birth registration forms. She reached Juniper's bed, handed her a sheet, and said, "Please fill out this section for me. It's for your emergency contact. You only need to write down a name and telephone number." Rafferty had just reached the doorway with a cup of hot tea from the cafeteria downstairs, and he stopped there because the curtain had been drawn, and he didn't want to intrude while the nurse was working. He remained outside the doorway. He saw Juniper take the pen. She looked at the form. She didn't write anything. She sat motionless for so long that the nurse turned back and asked whether she needed the instructions repeated. Then the nurse left to attend to something else before returning once more. Juniper was still sitting there with the pen in her hand. In her mind, Rafferty imagined, she was moving through every name she knew, and he understood how painfully short that list was because he'd known since that July night in the delivery doorway. Her parents, her brother, the man who had left, then nothing. That was the end. At last, she lowered her head and began to write. She formed each letter neatly and carefully, the way people wrote when they knew they were putting something important on paper. She wrote her own name. The nurse returned, picked up the form, glanced over it, then stopped. She said, "I'm sorry, but this can't be you. It has to be someone else. This is the person we would call if anything happened to you." Juniper looked at the paper in the nurse's hand. Then she asked in a weightless voice, the voice of someone asking when a train departed or where to find the restroom, "Could I leave it blank?" The young nurse stood there without knowing what to say. She was very young, probably newly graduated, and no one had taught her how to answer a question like that. She said, "Let me check," then carried the form away. Juniper lay down, turned her face toward the window, and pulled the blanket over herself. Rafferty was still standing outside the doorway with the cold cup of tea in his hand. He'd heard everything from beginning to end without missing a single word. He remained there for a long while, long enough that another nurse had to walk around him and gave him a curious glance. Then he set the tea on the small table in the hallway, entered the room, pulled the gray plastic chair close to the side of the bed, and sat down. She didn't turn around. He didn't say anything either. He simply sat there. He remained there throughout that evening, and he sat there every evening that followed. Grady Vaughn arrived one afternoon, and Rafferty recognized him before anyone had the chance to say his name, because he was the kind of man people noticed immediately in a hospital corridor. His shirt was crisply pressed, his hair neatly combed, and his shoes polished clean even though the streets outside were still covered in salt and dirty water. He carried a cream-colored teddy bear with its cardboard price tag still tied to one ear. He smiled before he spoke, the kind of smile prepared in advance and unrelated to anything happening around him. Juniper saw him, and her entire body went rigid, and Rafferty was already rising from the gray plastic chair before he had time to think. Grady didn't lower his voice. He deliberately refused to lower it. 2 nurses were in the corridor, along with a man waiting for the elevator and an elderly woman sitting in one of the waiting chairs. And Grady Vaughn spoke loudly enough for every one of them to hear. He said, "Do you know who you're standing beside, June? This entire city knows. His wife died. His child died. No one has dared go near him in years." Then suddenly, a delivery girl appears, with no home, no family, no money, and not even one person who would come looking if she disappeared. And he takes care of her. He handles everything. He let those words settle, then continued more softly, more venomously. He said, "Do you think he wants you? He wants to fill the place that was left empty. You aren't a woman to him, June. You're an empty space being filled." Every word he said was true. That was what made it cruel. Rafferty's wife was gone. No one had come near him in years. Juniper had no one. He'd taken care of her. Every word was true, and every word had been stripped of everything that gave the truth its meaning. Rafferty knew exactly what was being placed before him. One punch in that corridor, in front of that many witnesses, and he would lose everything, and she would lose the only support she had left. Grady had come there to take that from them. So Rafferty didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He stepped forward exactly once and spoke in the same steady tone, yet everyone in the corridor could hear every word. He asked, "Where do you live, Mr. Vaughn?" Grady blinked. He said, "What?" Rafferty said, "The apartment in Lakewood. I drove the route this morning. 41 minutes. Then he continued, neither faster nor louder, only as steadily as a man reading from a list. He said, "You didn't drive those 41 minutes the day she had to take a bus alone to the emergency room because she was vomiting blood. You didn't drive them during the week. Her rented room lost power, and she slept on a plastic chair outside the laundromat because the dryers inside were still warm. You didn't drive them the night she walked through this neighborhood asking whether any man would put his name beside hers for exactly 1 hour. You didn't drive them once throughout her entire pregnancy. Not once." The corridor became utterly silent. The nurse standing at the desk had set down her pen. Rafferty said, "You drove them today, after this entire neighborhood began talking." Then he said the final words. "You didn't come here because of your child, Mr. Vaughn. You came because someone else did, and you can't bear what that reveals about you. I can't help you with that. No one can. Only those 41 minutes of road could have helped you, and you had them from the beginning." Grady Vaughn stood there holding the teddy bear. The color of his face changed. He said several things about attorneys, about his rights, about having a child in that room and refusing to let this matter go, and his voice grew louder with every sentence, rising in the way a man's voice did when he knew he'd lost and was trying to conceal it with volume. Then he placed the teddy bear on the row of waiting chairs, its price tag still dangling from one ear, and walked toward the elevator. He drove 41 minutes home. He never called an attorney. Augie Pell was waiting for him in the parking lot that evening. He said nothing about what had happened in the corridor, because the news had reached him before Rafferty had even made it to the ground floor. He simply handed Rafferty a sheet of paper folded in half and said, "Full name, home address, workplace, and the time he returns home." Then he added, in the calm voice of a man reporting inventory, that Vaughn had no one behind him, no business associates, nothing at all. "If you want him gone from this city, he'll be gone within 3 days, and no one will ask a single question." Rafferty took the paper, climbed into his car, and didn't start the engine. He sat there for 40 minutes. During those 40 minutes, the thing speaking inside his head wasn't anger. It was something much calmer, and therefore much more dangerous. It spoke very softly. It said this would be easy. It said you've done greater things than this. It said the girl would never have to see that man's face again. Everything would be clean. No one would suffer, and you would sleep well. The voice sounded exactly like his father's. Then Rafferty opened the glove compartment. Inside, beneath a flashlight and several vehicle registration papers, lay another sheet of paper, whose edges had yellowed. The same name, the same address. He'd had it since the summer, from before that July night in the delivery doorway. He'd ordered someone to find Grady as soon as he learned Juniper was pregnant, because it was instinct. Because a man bearing the Koval name had to know where everything was before he did anything else. He'd known the man's name, where he slept, and what time he left work for all those months. Yet he hadn't opened that compartment even once. The reason was so simple that it hurt. If Rafferty went looking for Grady Vaughn and dragged him back, Juniper would never know whether Grady would have come on his own. All her life, people had made decisions for her. They'd signed for her, chosen for her, arranged her life according to what they believed was best for her, and not one of them had asked her a single question first. He'd done exactly that with the delivery contract, and she'd stood beneath the delivery light and told him to his face, "You didn't help me. You handled me." If he did this too, he would become merely another man on her long list. She had the right to know the truth. She had the right to know that the man had possessed those 41 minutes of road from the beginning and had chosen not to drive them. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Rafferty stood in the parking lot behind the restaurant, beneath the delivery light where he'd been leaving food all year, and burned both sheets of paper in the aluminum ashtray the kitchen staff kept outside. He watched them burn completely. Later, when he told her what he'd done, he concealed nothing. He said he'd been raised by the kind of men who solved problems by making people disappear. He said he'd once been that kind of man. He said that night he'd wanted to become that man again more than he'd wanted anything in many years. And I'm not telling you this so you'll praise me. I'm telling you so you'll know who I am. Then he said the only thing that stopped him wasn't morality. It was imagining that 20 years later, he might have to tell the little girl what her father had done for her. He said he didn't want any version of that story to exist. Juniper listened without interrupting. Then she bent down, searched through the cloth bag beside the bed, and took out the blue-covered notebook. She held it out to him. He didn't take it. He said, "This belongs to you." She said, "I know." Then she said, "I'm giving it to you because I don't want it to belong only to me anymore." He took it. It was heavier than he'd expected, swollen with years of papers tucked between its pages, and every page held tiny rows of numbers recording every dollar, every month, every year, an entire life counted with a ballpoint pen borrowed from a pharmacy counter. He turned to the final page. There were no numbers there. There were words, brief lines written to someone who hadn't yet been born, one line for every week, and the final line had been written only a few days earlier, the handwriting uneven because it had been written from a hospital bed. It said, "I've been afraid for 9 months that you would be born with no one waiting for you. Tonight, men got out of bed at 1 o'clock in the morning to clear Fulton Road so your mother could pass. You aren't coming into this world alone. I was wrong." The following spring, Juniper applied for a nursing internship program at the large hospital on the west side, a paid program that offered a scholarship for the final semester. Exactly what she needed, and exactly what she was qualified for. She passed the application review. She passed the interview. Then the rejection letter arrived. 3 polite lines offering no reason. She didn't tell him. He knew because she stopped mentioning it, and she only stopped talking about things when they'd hurt her. Rafferty looked into it, and finding things out was what he did best. 3 days later, he had an internal copy of her application file in his hands, and in the lower corner of the second page, beneath the personnel department's notes, there was a single line. It said the applicant had a personal relationship with an individual, considered a person of interest to law enforcement, and recommended that the risk to the hospital's reputation be taken into consideration. His name wasn't there. It didn't need to be. He sat in his car in the parking lot and read that line again and again, and he realized something he'd never been forced to confront in his entire life. He could buy the hospital outright. He could find the person who'd written that note, sit across from them, and name the school their child attended. But there was no way anywhere in the world, for him to buy her a clean name. The problem wasn't someone else. The problem was him. He was the risk. That same week, a woman waited for Juniper in the parking lot outside her workplace. She had short hair and wore a cloth coat, and an unmarked gray car was parked at an angle across the street, the same car Rafferty had stared directly at one morning outside Deschler's office several seasons earlier. She handed Juniper a business card bearing the name Detective Rosalind Merck, and she made no threats. She said, "I don't believe you've done anything wrong. I believe you're standing beside a man I've been following for years." She said, "I'm going to tell you the part no one else tells you. If the day comes when I succeed at my job, you'll lose everything he has given you. The house, the job, the insurance, all of it. Even if you had nothing to do with any of it. That's how it works. I don't like it, but I can't change it." Juniper brought the business card home and gave it to him. She didn't cry or blame him. She simply placed it on the kitchen table and said, "I thought you should know. Rafferty didn't break anything. He didn't call anyone. He began doing something that took 14 months and that no one saw. He didn't dismantle everything because if he did, 40 small stores along that road would lose their protection overnight, and someone else would fill the space before the end of the week. He transferred it. He gathered the store owners, hired a real attorney, and registered a merchants association with a legal name, an official seal, financial records subject to audit, and a shared fund to hire security and take matters to court when necessary. Then he removed himself from the governing board, retaining no seat and no vote. Augie Pell stood in the depot doorway and remained silent for a long time after Rafferty finished explaining. Then he asked in a hoarse voice, "Who will protect them now?" Rafferty said, "The law." The old man looked at him as though he'd spoken in a foreign language. Rafferty repeated it more softly. "The law, Augie." For the first time, the years that followed passed in the way decent years always passed, which meant there was nothing to tell except the small things, and the small things were everything. Rafferty lost most of his income, and he lost something harder to name as well. A man who had once bowed his head every time they crossed paths in the coffee shop now walked past him without looking. Juniper completed her final semester through evening classes, slept 4 hours a night, and graduated on a May afternoon inside a sweltering auditorium with no air conditioning. In the last row, Maeve sat on Augie Pell's lap, and while the names were being read, the little girl suddenly stood on his knees and shouted, "Mama," so loudly that her voice rang through the entire auditorium. A whole row of people turned around laughing, and Juniper, walking across the stage, had to stop for a moment to catch her breath. She took a job at the same community clinic where Dr. Adeyemi still worked, and she requested the Thursday morning shift. No one wanted that shift. Thursdays were for people without insurance. They began lining up before the doors opened. Their records were complicated. Every story was long, and by the end of the shift, the staff went home unable to speak another word. Juniper asked for it, and kept it through all the years that followed. She never explained why, and no one needed her to. Wilhelmina Drago died in the autumn at the age of 75, in the hospital, during the night, and Juniper was the person sitting beside her, because by then, she was a nurse and knew how to arrange a shift change. Several weeks earlier, Willa had given Maeve a small book with a hard cover that she'd drawn by hand, made with thick paper, crayon colors, and the trembling handwriting of an old woman. She said, "Keep this and read it with your mother." Then she said nothing else about it. On her final night, she held Juniper's hand and told her something about her younger brother that no one else heard, and Juniper never repeated it to anyone, not even to Rafferty, not even many years later. As for their first kiss, there was nothing romantic about it. They were in the kitchen behind the restaurant at 11 o'clock at night. She just finished a 12-hour shift. Her hair was stuck to her temples. Her clothes still carried the smell of antiseptic, and she sat on the stool beside the steel table, finishing the cold noodles he'd saved for her. He leaned against the sink and watched her eat. She looked up and caught him staring, and she instinctively raised a hand to smooth her hair, then lowered it because she knew it was hopeless. She said, "I'm sorry. I smell terrible." He said, "I know." Then he stepped forward, bent down, and kissed her. She set her fork on the steel table, and the only sound in the kitchen was the steady hum of the exhaust fan, just as it had been for all those years. When they drew apart, she rested her forehead against his chest and whispered, "I'm so afraid of this," he said. "So am I." She said, "Don't be the one who leaves." He said, "I've never left anywhere in my life. That's my entire personality. In fact, it's a documented flaw." She laughed against his shirt, a wet and ugly laugh, and the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. Drago's still opened at 6 o'clock in the morning after Willa died, because her granddaughter took over and kept everything exactly as it had been, including the opening hour that no one remembered the reason for anymore. Rafferty stopped there one evening in March to buy milk and a box of cookies Maeve had demanded, and he was standing at the register when the door flew open behind him. The boy didn't enter like a robber. He entered like someone who'd been walking through the cold for a long time and no longer knew where he was going. He was thin, wearing a hoodie far too light for the weather, and in his hand was a paring knife he'd probably taken from his family's kitchen. He said the thing people always said in situations like that, but his voice broke halfway through the sentence, and the hand holding the knife trembled so violently that it was visible from the other side of the counter. Willa's granddaughter stood frozen beside the register. Rafferty had walked through many rooms where someone was holding a knife, and he knew how to recognize the dangerous kind. The dangerous ones were calm. This boy wasn't dangerous. He was drowning. Rafferty told him, "Put that down, son, and we'll talk." Then he took one step forward, only one, slowly, with both hands visible. The boy panicked. It happened very quickly. One movement that was almost more of a startled reflex than a stab, and then everything stopped. Rafferty sat down on the floor with his back against the milk refrigerator, one hand pressed to his side. The knife struck the tile with a hard, dry sound. The boy stood there with his face drained white, and he began saying no, 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 over and over, unable to stop. Willa's granddaughter had already called for help, and the man sitting on the grocery store floor, the man who had once made everyone on the east side of the city cross the street when they saw him coming, looked up at the boy and asked only one question. He asked, "What's your name?" The boy stood motionless. Rafferty asked again, more slowly. The boy told him. Rafferty nodded and repeated the name once to make certain he had it right. Then he said, "Sit down, son. Sit over there. Don't run. If you run, this becomes something else." The boy sat beside the bread shelves, covered his head with his arms, and wept, and he remained there until help arrived. Later, people learned that he was 19. He'd been injured at the warehouse where he worked, and they'd prescribed painkillers. Then, his insurance expired, and by then, he couldn't stop, and that night he needed money. Juniper Holloway was working in the emergency room that evening. She was in the intake area when the doors opened, and they wheeled him inside, and she saw his face before she saw the name written on the form. She didn't cry out. She didn't freeze. The doctor on duty that night later said he'd never seen anyone work with such precision. She read the vital signs, called the right people, prepared exactly what was needed, and answered every question in a steady voice. When Rafferty tried to say something, she placed her hand on his shoulder and said, "Be quiet and let me work." Her hands didn't tremble once. When his condition was stable, and they took him upstairs, she walked into the corridor, passed through the double doors, turned into an alcove where empty carts were stored, and no one was present, then lowered herself onto the tile floor with her back against the wall. Only then did she begin to shake. She sat there for about 10 minutes. Then she stood, washed her face, and returned to finish her shift. When he woke the following morning, she was sitting in the chair beside his bed, still wearing her work clothes. He tried to say something light-hearted to ease her worry. She didn't allow him to speak. She said, "Mr. Koval, I'm going to tell you something," she said. "I didn't study nursing because I liked it. I studied it because 3 times I stood and watched the people I loved most leave this world, and I didn't know what to do. My father, my mother, Ash. 3 times, I simply stood there with empty hands, not knowing whom to call, not knowing what to do, only watching." She took his hand, and at last her voice broke. She said, "Yesterday was the first time in my life that I knew what to do." The trial took place that summer. The boy had no attorney except the one appointed by the court, and his mother sat in the back row and cried throughout the proceedings. Rafferty said nothing. He only sat there. Juniper was the person who rose to address the court. She said she'd received the victim in the emergency room that night. She said she'd had a younger brother who was 19, the same age, caught by the same thing, and no one had asked for help for him, and he hadn't survived that winter. She said she wasn't asking the court to excuse what the boy had done. She was asking the court to place him in a treatment program instead of simply sending him to prison, because after prison, he would come out and everything would still be exactly the same. She said, "I'm not doing this because I'm kind. I'm doing it because I've already seen the other ending." It happened on a September evening, so ordinary that afterward, no one could remember which day of the week it had been. Maeve was 5 years old, wearing green socks printed with dinosaurs that she stubbornly refused to replace, even though one big toe had worn through, and she was standing on a kitchen chair so she could reach the counter where her mother was slicing carrots. In her hands was Willa's book with the hardcover, the book she'd carried throughout the house for years, its 4 corners worn and one torn page repaired with tape. Rafferty sat at the end of the table peeling garlic. Without looking up or giving any warning, Maeve said, "Mama, when are you going to marry Uncle Rafe?" The knife in Juniper's hand stopped. She set it down, wiped her hands on a towel, and sat in the chair across from her daughter. And Rafferty knew immediately that she was about to do the thing she'd feared for 5 years. She said, "Listen to me, sweetheart." She said, "Uncle Rafe loves you very much, and he will always be here, but he isn't your biological father. Your biological father is another man. His name is Grady, and I'm sorry I've let you think of him as just an uncle all these years without explaining." She said, "That was my fault, not yours." When she finished, she managed to keep her face calm, but both hands resting on the table had gone white. Maeve looked at her mother with the expression of a 5-year-old child being forced to explain something obvious to a slow adult. She said, "I already know." Juniper said, "You know?" Maeve said, "Yes. Miss Willa drew it for me." Then she opened the book in her hands and turned expertly to the exact page she wanted. The page more worn than all the others because it had been opened so many times. On that thick sheet of paper, drawn in crayon with the trembling strokes of a 75-year-old woman, was the back door of a building. There was a windowsill. A cup sat on the sill, and a man in a black coat was walking away with his back turned as he went inside. Beneath the picture, written in the wavering capital letters of someone whose hand had grown weak, was one sentence. "Everyone has a biological father, but a dad has to remember your name." Juniper looked at those words and couldn't speak. She'd read that book to her daughter hundreds of evenings. She'd read that very sentence in her own voice, read it while sleepy, read it while thinking about something else, read it so many times that she knew it by heart, and not once had she heard what it was saying. Maeve closed the book and turned to Rafferty. She said, "Uncle Rafe, do you remember my name?" He said, "Maeve Ash Halloway." The little girl grinned, satisfied, because she'd asked the question so she could hear her full name, not because she'd ever doubted him. Then she frowned. She asked, "Who is Ash?" The kitchen fell silent. Juniper rose from her chair. walked to the kitchen doorway, and stood there with one hand gripping the frame. She'd never spoken that name in front of her daughter. She'd placed it in the middle of the little girl's name, and kept it there as though she were keeping something inside a locked drawer. Rafferty set the garlic on the table. He said, "Come sit here with me first." Maeve climbed down from the chair she'd been standing on, scrambled onto another, and rested both elbows on the table. He said, "Ash was your mother's younger brother." His full name was Ashton Michael Halloway. He was 19 years old. He worked at Miss Willa's store while he was still in school. He stocked the shelves and often forgot to lock the back door. He said Ash kept fish in a tank in his room, and he gave each one a name. Every fish had a name of its own. Maeve asked, "Did you ever meet him?" Rafferty said, "No, I never met him." Then he said, "But I remember his name. There are some people whose names we have to remember for someone else, sweetheart. Because sometimes people are hurting too much to say those names aloud." Maeve nodded as though that were the most ordinary thing in the world, then asked what the fish were called. Rafferty said, "I don't know that part. You'll have to ask your mother." Juniper was still standing in the kitchen doorway with one hand covering her mouth, and she didn't make a sound. By the time the wound in his side had healed into a faint line that Maeve called Uncle Rafe's worm, they were married in the yard behind the depot, between two parallel rows of parked trucks, with 31 guests and one long table built from pallets and covered with a white cloth. Augie Pell cried from beginning to end and spent the entire day blaming the pollen, even though it was October, and by October in Cleveland, there wasn't a single flower left in bloom. The adoption was finalized the following spring. Grady Vaughn signed away his parental rights and returned the papers by mail. He didn't come to court and didn't include a single additional word. At the back of the courtroom that day, leaning against the wall near the exit, stood Detective Rosalind Merck. She didn't speak to anyone. When the judge brought down the gavel, she looked at Rafferty for a moment, nodded exactly once, then turned and walked out, and the door closed behind her. She never explained, and he never asked. But the thing he kept longest from all those days came on the morning of the wedding, when he was tying his necktie in the small room at the depot, and Maeve knocked on the door, then pressed a sheet of paper into his hand. It had been folded into quarters by a child, so every crease was crooked. Written on it in crayon was a list, the letters uneven in size, some of them written backward. It contained Mama's name, Maeve's name, Uncle Ash's name, Miss Willa's name, Uncle Augie's name, and on the final line, written in blue, was Morella's name. He asked the little girl how she knew her. Maeve said, "I don't." Then she said, "Mama told me you remember everyone's name, so I thought someone should remember hers for you." He taped that sheet of paper to the inside of the refrigerator door. It was still there. She'd asked him to be her husband for one day, and he'd made her tell him why. The first reason was a declaration, and 2 days in which to submit it. And it was true. The second reason was a cup of coffee on a windowsill, and a man who knew how to turn his back and walk away. And it hadn't come from her, but from an old woman behind a grocery store counter. The third reason didn't arrive until 5 years later, from a little girl wearing dinosaur socks and standing on a kitchen chair. Grady Vaughn could create a child, and he had. That wasn't the difficult part. Biology was the easy part. Half the world could do it. The difficult part was remembering. Remembering someone's name when they had nothing left that should make them worth remembering. Remembering the name of a young man you'd never met because the child's mother was hurting too deeply to speak it. His father had taught him that lesson inside a truck on a Thursday night, and it took Rafferty nearly his entire life to understand that his father had been only half right. Tomas remembered everyone's name. Yes, but he did it so people would need him. That wasn't remembering. That was ownership. Truly remembering was placing a cup of coffee on a windowsill, turning your back, and walking inside without remaining there to wait for a single word of thanks. If there has ever been anyone in your life who remembered your name when you felt invisible, please share your story in the comments below, and let us know where you're listening from tonight. Who did today's story make you think of? And how did it make you feel? We sincerely want to read the words you share from the depths of your heart. If this story touched you, please click like, share it with a friend who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so that warm stories like this one will be waiting for you every day. We wish you and your family abundant health, and may every passing day bring you peace and happiness. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.